I'm back in Visual Studio Code, the IDE I will use. So I have an empty folder, and again I will now create a new file with a command, and by pressing this icon here, and this file can have any name you want, but often you name it server.js or app.js because it is the root file that makes up your Node.js application. So the Node.js code you will execute on a computer in the cloud on a server at the end. So I will name it app.js here. Now in this file, I want to create a server through Node.js, and thus far we already saw how can we work with the file system. So how can we not spend on such a server? We again need to import some functionality because the way JavaScript works both for the browser and Node.js, there's a handful of functions and objects we can use globally without importing anything into the file, but generally most functionalities are not available by default. To not pollute our global namespace with all these series of keywords and names basically, and also to make it very obvious in each file on which functionality this file depends. And thus far, this file does not depend on anything. Now with that, let's use that HTTP module, and to use it, we need to import it. So we basically need to make sure that we can use features from that HTTP module which Node.js ships with. We need to make sure that we can use these features in this file. And for this, we import that functionality. We do this by creating a new constant. And you could create a var or use let2. Since we will have some value here which we will never change, we can also just use a const to make this really clear that we will never touch this again. We will use it, but we will never overwrite it. You can give this any name you want, but typically you keep the name of the module you're importing. So I will name this HTTP, but again you could rename this to whatever you want. Then you have an equal sign. And now we need to assign a value, and now there's a special keyword, special function Node.js does export globally. So you can use it by default at any file you run via Node.js, and that is the required keyword. Now this is simply the way you import files and Node.js. Require either takes a path to another file. You can also import your own JavaScript files, but we will not do this for now. Also, if you don't have a path to one of your files, you can also import a core module like HTTP. By the way, a path to one of your files always has to start with the dot slash or slash. If it is an absolute path, dot slash will be a relative path. So this will lead to the same folder and will not look for an HTTP file. By the way, it automatically adds .js at the end. You don't need to add that on your own, but you can. But this now look for a local file named HTTP. If you omit dot slash or slash at the beginning, it will not look for a local file. So even if you had a local file named http.js, it will not import this file. It will always look for a global module named HTTP, and indeed such module exists because Node.js ships with it. And now we got this imported, and now we can start using functionalities from that global module. And you can see that if we type http dot, this is how you access functions and so-called methods and properties of objects and JavaScript. And as you can see, this HTTP object, which we import from the HTTP module, has a bunch of fields and methods we can execute. Most importantly, it has a create server method. Now, as the name suggests, this is a crucial method when it comes to creating a server. And the create server, actually, if we hover over it, we can see it actually takes a so-called request listener as an argument. A request listener simply is a function that will execute for every incoming request. So let's define as such a function. For this, I will create a new function with the function keyword. We can name it however you want, argue listener, or whatever you want. The name is totally up to you. This function has to receive two arguments. You can see that here, if you hover over that, the request listener receives a request which is of type incoming message and a response object. So in short, Node.js automatically gives us some object that presents the incoming request and allow us to read a data from that request. And it gives us an object response, which we can use to return a response to whoever sent that request. So now we have to accept these two arguments here, and we can again name the arguments however you want. You just keep in mind that the first one will contain data about the request, and the second one will help you send a response. So I will name it read and the rest. And these are typical shortcuts you often see. Now this is a function argue listener, and now we can pass this function reference. So we don't execute it. Don't say this. Just put the name to that function because this will simply tell the create server, hey, please look for this function for with this name and execute it for every incoming request. So this is now what we set up. So this function will now run for every request that reaches our server, which will be started by calling create server, or almost one piece is missing. I will come back to that. This is one way of doing it. So now you don't have to explicitly create such a function. You can also use a so-called anonymous function. So here, you can also type a function rect like this. This is another function without a name. That's why it's called anonymous, and it still achieves the same. We pass that function to create server, and therefore now we execute this function whenever a request reaches our server. This is an event-driven architecture Node.js uses heavily. You work along with the such setups or such node snippets where you tell the node if X happens, do Y. In this case, if a request comes, please execute this function. Now you can also use next-gen JavaScript syntax and use an arrow key function where you omit the function keyword and just have two arguments followed by an equal sign and a greater than sign, hence an arrow, and then function body. This is basically equivalent to the function keyword approach. This is our create server callback function as it's called. It's called by Node.js whenever a request reaches our server. For now, let's simply console log the request object to see what's inside. Now if we execute this file, we can do this in the built-in terminal, which is navigated to this project folder. Make sure we go into that project folder. Once you are in the terminal, navigate it in that folder. You can run node and then app.js. This will execute the app.js file, and let's see what it does. Nothing, right? We don't see console log, and that makes sense because we didn't send a request to the server. We don't even know where the server is. How do we reach that server? Which address does it have? Well, one important thing is missing. This create server method actually returns a server. So we have to store that and a new variable or constant. And I will use a constant because I will never override it. I only create a server once. So now the created server is stored here. And now we can use that server and do something with it. As you can see, we get a bunch of methods we can call, and one method is listen. Listen now actually starts a process where the Node.js will not immediately exit our script, but where Node.js will instead keep this running to listen. So that's why this method is named like this for incoming request. Now listen, as you can see, takes a couple of arguments and option arguments. The first one is the port on which you want to listen. Now in production, you typically would not fill this out, and it would take the default of port 80. But here on local development, we want to use a different port, and you can also define a host name. Now by default, this will be the name of the machine this is running on. So for our local machine, this is a local host by default. Let's just pass a port. 3000 is a port you often use, but you are relatively free to use any port you want. The 1000 ports are typically pretty safe. And now with that, if we re-execute this, you will see one important thing. Cursor here in the terminal doesn't go back at the new line because this processor here is still running. This file execution didn't finish because we now get an ongoing looping process where this will keep on listening for a request. And this is obviously what you want. You want to have a web server that keeps on listening for a request. Now we can see that in action by opening a new browser window where we simply enter localhost 3000. And once you do that, nothing happens because we haven't configured it to return any HTML page. But if you go back to your terminal, you will see a lot up there. And that is this line. This is your request being logged to the console. This few line here already give you a fully functional or almost fully functional web server. And this is how you create servers in Node.js.